Hey, Mike here. I just wanted to let you know that you can listen to Dark Poutine early and ad-free on Amazon Music, included with Prime. Welcome back to Dark Poutine. I am Mike Brown.
And I'm Matthew.
You are. Last time I checked. How are things, Matthew?
Good. How are things with you?
Well, you know, busy. Like you said, you're busy too.
We have a ye oldie one today.
Yes, we do. So let's ye old.
The views, information, and opinions expressed during the Dark Poutine podcast are solely those of the producer and do not necessarily represent those of Curious Cast, its affiliate, Global News, nor their parent company, Chorus Entertainment.
Dark Poutine is not for the faint of heart or squeamish. Listener discretion is strongly advised. We're not experts on the topics we present, nor are we journalists. We're two ordinary Canadian schmucks chatting about crime and the dark side of history. Let's get to it. Put on your toque, grab yourself a double-double and a Nanaimo bar. It's time to scarf down some Dark Poutine.
You are responsible for obtaining and maintaining at your own cost all equipment needed to listen to Dark Poutine. Dark Poutine can be addictive. Side effects may include, but not be limited to, pausing and questioning the system, elevated heart rate, pondering humanity, odd looks from colleagues as you laugh out loud at work, family members not into true crime worrying about you. Positive side effects may include some perspectives and opinions that you disagree with, as well as some wokeness and empathy. If you don't think Dark Poutine is for you, consult your doctor immediately.
On a warm summer evening in June 1887, 17-year-old Mary Pickering Tuplin vanished from her family's farm in Margate, PEI. A search and grim discovery followed that would rock the quiet farming community to its core. Mary's body was found in the Southwest River, weighed down by a heavy stone, and she had 2 gunshot wounds in her head. The subsequent investigation would uncover a web of secrets, including the fact that Mary was 6 months pregnant. Circumstantial evidence led to 19-year-old William Millman's arrest, allegedly Mary's lover. The shocking facts of the crime and its investigation led to a sensational trial that captivated the entire country. Millman was convicted and sent to the gallows in April 1888. Was justice indeed served, or as some speculate, was an innocent man sent to the gallows? This is Dark Poutine episode 359, Margate Horror, the murder of Mary Pickering Tuplin. Mary Pickering Tuplin was born on May 5, 1870 to John Tuplin and Margaret Marks, and they lived in Margate, Prince Edward Island. Mary grew up in Black Horse Corner, a community with a rich history closely tied to the region's development of transportation and commerce. In the early 19th century, Margate was a thriving settlement along the Old Post Road, which connected Summerside to Charlottetown. The area, known as Black Horse Corner, derived its name from a public house or livery that served travelers along this vital route. Between 1820 and 1840, settlers to the area began arriving in more significant numbers, establishing the public house and liveries to cater to the needs of those traveling along the Old Post Road. However, despite its strategic location, Margate remained a relatively small settlement due to the poor quality of the roads. Many travelers preferred to make the journey between Summerside and Charlottetown by boat rather than endure the slow and dusty land route. The fortunes of Margate and Black Horse Corner took a significant turn in the 1870s with the arrival of the railway. Initially, Margate benefited significantly from this new mode of transportation. However, in a twist of fate, the railway route was ultimately planned to bypass Margate entirely, instead passing through the nearby village of Barrett's Cross, which would later be renamed Kensington. With the railway now running through Kensington, that small village was poised to become the new commercial center for the district. The once prosperous Margate and Black Horse Corner faced the prospect of decline as trade and commerce shifted toward the rail line. Recognizing the changing economic landscape, many business owners in Margate decided to relocate their operations to Kensington.
Yeah, so, this is a classic story, isn't it? It's, town does well, something new comes along, town gets left in the dust.
Yeah.
Margate had that, the bad luck of being on the wrong side of progress here. First it was horses and carriages, then boom, railways, and suddenly Margate's old tech that nobody wants anymore,
Yep. It happened so many times when they built a railway and it bypassed a certain town and they went through another way that was maybe point A to point B a little closer, and then town doesn't exist anymore.
Yeah.
Today, while Black Horse Corner may no longer be the bustling center it once was, it remains an essential part of Margate's heritage, reflecting the broader changes that shaped Prince Edward Island's development. During all these changes and the slowdown in Black Horse Corner's economy, Mary Tuplin lived at home with her parents, John and Margaret, and siblings, including her brothers James, William, John Jr., and Andrew. She also had two married sisters, Josephine Slavin and Wilda Summers. On New Year's Eve, 1886, about 6 months before her death, Mary met William Millman at a dance. Some recalled a kiss between the two at the dance, and then William walked Mary home at 3 a.m. There was another brief kiss on the doorstep before Mary went inside, and William left. According to Max Haynes' story on the case, William Millman returned the next week to visit Mary. John Tuplin, Mary's father, later testified that Millman and Mary were alone in the kitchen late that night after the rest of the family had gone to bed. Hours later, John woke up and realized that Mary and William were still downstairs alone. From his room, John yelled that it was time for William to leave and for Mary to get to bed. John heard William go out the door and Mary went to her room. John said this was the only time he knew of that William Millman had been inside their home and alone with Mary for a significant period.
Yeah, it's interesting if this is the only time he'd ever been in there and that suddenly, if it's one visit and suddenly months later, this guy's name is being whispered in every kitchen in town, right? It's either a hell of a coincidence or people are looking for villain and landed on the most convenient one somehow.
So you know how small towns are, people talk.
Oh, yeah.
And sometimes there's a grain of truth to the talk. William Millman was not the only boy who had an interest in Mary. In the months before her disappearance, she'd been seen with several other young men in the area. Her father once caught Mary sitting with two boys, Joe Bryanton and Brad MacArthur, and he scared them off. He also mentioned seeing Albie Bryanton around their property a few times. In the weeks before she vanished, in the evening, only 2 days before she disappeared, Mary was nowhere to be found. It was Sunday. Where was she? Mary had just snuck out without a word. When Mary came home, she did not reveal where she'd been, saying only that she'd been out for a walk. The last time Mary's family saw her alive was on the evening of June 28, 1887. The family had just returned from burying John Jr., who had passed away after a lengthy illness. Mary was sitting in the kitchen with family members cradling her sister's baby. The normalcy of the scene made what happened next all the more jarring. Mary suddenly stood up and again walked out the front door without a word or apparent provocation. She was wearing only a light cotton dress and old boots, hardly attire for an intended outing, especially as dusk was setting in.
It's such a strange thing just to sort of push back your chair and walk out the door. Right? It's interesting, like this story seems sort of normal until now, and then suddenly, somebody just walks out the door.
All of a sudden, gotta go, or it doesn't say anything and just disappears.
Yeah, what's that, that line you often hear in movies, my dad went out for a pack of cigarettes and never came back.
Yeah.
Right? It's like, people just don't walk out the door very often,
No, especially with what happened next. The family's initial assumption that Mary had just stepped out briefly gave way to mounting concern as the minutes passed. Mary's mother was the first to go looking, venturing outside after about 20 minutes. Finding no trace of her daughter, Margaret alerted John, who began a more extensive search. They felt a growing sense of alarm as minutes stretched into hours with no sign of Mary. The worried father first checked with nearby neighbors, thinking Mary might have gone to visit, just like she had the other night. When this yielded no results, he began scouring their own property, calling Mary's name into the gathering darkness. The night passed with no response and no sign of the missing girl. As dawn broke on June 29th, the search intensified and expanded. John Tuplin drove to neighboring towns questioning anyone who might have seen Mary. He enlisted the help of community members, and word of the disappearance spread quickly. The fact that Mary had never before left home for that amount of time without explanation added to the sense of urgency and foreboding. Interestingly, suspicion fell on William Millman quite early on in the investigation. On Thursday, just 2 days after Mary's disappearance, John Tuplin traveled to Summerside to see lawyer Bell and obtained a warrant for William Millman's arrest. John Tuplin suspected something untoward had occurred between Millman and his daughter. Nothing was found initially. By Friday, July 1st, 3 days after Mary's disappearance, someone searching for Mary found a white handkerchief with an embroidered letter M in one corner, which matched the one that Mary was known to have carried. Mary's mother confirmed that this was Mary's handkerchief. From then on, the search efforts became more organized and focused on the Southwest River.
I always find clues in old stories kind of romantic in a way.
Yeah, this one especially.
You know, it's not DNA, it's not technical stuff. It's like something that's left behind, something small that says, you know, you're on the right track.
Yeah, it's a handkerchief with an embroidered letter M, which is...
It's not exactly a flashing neon sign, but it's enough for people to kind of go, okay, then maybe it's over here. She's over here, right? It's fascinating.
If it wasn't true, you would think Agatha Christie had written that.
Yeah, exactly.
John Tuplin borrowed a scow from Benjamin Bryanton to help search the waterway. Community members turned out in force to assist, combing the riverbanks and probing the waters. Notably absent from the search parties was William Millman, a fact that would later be emphasized during his trial. The search continued through the weekend without success, adding to the community's collective anxiety. It wasn't until Monday, July 4th, a whole week after Mary had vanished, that the grim discovery was made. Archibald Bryanton, using grappling hooks to search the riverbed methodically, snagged something heavy. It was the body of Mary Tuplin. The discovery provided grim and undeniable evidence of a brutal murder. Found submerged in 4 to 5 feet of water near a spring, Mary's remains were in an advanced state of decomposition, having been in the water for approximately a week since her disappearance. The condition of the body painted a chilling picture of the crime and the efforts taken to conceal it. Mary was still clad in the light cotton dress and boots that she'd been wearing when she vanished. Most shockingly, her body had been weighed down with a heavy stone estimated to be around 45 kilograms and tied to her waist with a rope. It matched a stone that had gone missing from John Cousin's oyster boat around the time of Mary's disappearance. Someone had gone to great lengths to hide Mary's corpse.
There's sort of this moment in these cases when the body isn't found, even if people think the worst, right? The person could have just gotten on a boat or started over somewhere else, right?
Mm-hmm.
But once you have the body, there's no more pretending.
Right.
So that's always just such a finality in these cases. And then, of course, once you've got a body weighed down by a rock, then you start understanding that it was foul play, right?
Unless they've done it themselves. But in this case, we find that isn't so.
Yeah.
The post-mortem examination, partially performed right there on the shore, revealed the true horror of what had befallen young Mary. 2 gunshot wounds were found in her head, providing clear evidence of a violent death. Perhaps one of the most tragic revelations from her autopsy was that Mary had been 6 months pregnant at the time of her death. This detail suggested potential motives and raised questions about Mary's relationships and circumstances leading up to her murder. The deliberate nature of the gunshots, coupled with the careful weighing down and concealment of her body in the river, ruled out any possibility of accident or suicide. Every aspect of the crime pointed to a premeditated act of murder. The killer had not only taken Mary's life, but had gone to considerable effort to hide the evidence of their deed. The state in which Mary's body was found sent shockwaves through the community of Margate, the entirety of Prince Edward Island, and beyond. What had begun as a missing persons case turned into a horrific murder investigation, one that would captivate and disturb Prince Edward Island for years to come. The location where Mary was found, opposite Hiram Thompson's farm between the properties of Warren and Evans, became a somber landmark in the community. An impromptu inquest was held right there on the shore where her body had been brought. The peaceful riverbank transformed into a scene of tragedy and investigative activity. The impact on the Tuplin family was devastating. Having just laid one child to rest, they now faced the unthinkable task of burying another under the most tragic circumstances. The community rallied around them, offering support and sharing in their grief, but the sense of safety and trust that had once characterized their rural life had been irrevocably shattered. As news of the discovery spread, so did speculation and fear. Who could have committed such a heinous act? The peaceful farming community of Margate was thrust into the center of what would become one of Prince Edward Island's most notorious murder cases.
I bet Margate thought it had seen some things before this.
Right.
It's like bad harvests, bar fights, maybe the occasional scandal, but, for something to happen in such a small place that has become, part of the town's memory is huge, right?
Well, it's like the Carissa Boudreaux murder in Bridgewater, where I'm from. It only happened a few years ago, but it is part of that town's history now, and it's something that people still talk about a lot.
Absolutely.
And probably will.
Yeah.
Mary's secret pregnancy, of course, was scandalous, and Mary was described in the newspaper as enceinte, an outdated word referring to an unwed pregnant woman, bringing shame to the family. Due to the alleged length of the pregnancy, approximately 6 months, Mary's dad suspected only one man could be responsible, William Millman. He'd been the only young man he knew of who'd visited Mary in January and had spent time alone with her. So to Tuplin, the baby had to have been Millman's. Further circumstantial evidence arose when the church sexton Tom Bryanton and his wife came forward claiming prior knowledge of Mary's situation. Will Millman had heard the rumors about Mary's pregnancy and that he was responsible. Seeking confirmation, Will had approached Tom Bryanton on Sunday, June 26, knowing he was discreet and close to the Tuplin family. Tom confirmed the rumors and promised to have his wife inquire further during their visit to the Tuplins that evening, as Mary's younger brother was gravely ill. During the Bryantons' visit, Mary confided in Tom's wife, confirming her pregnancy and identifying Will Millman as her only lover. It was not lost on everyone that this had happened only 2 days before her murder. Tuplin and other investigators believe that William held back this information from them for one reason. He had killed Mary to avoid responsibility for fathering her child. The Millman-Tuplin murder trial began on January 24, 1888 in the Charlottetown Supreme Court, with Mr. Justice Hensley presiding alongside Chief Justice Palmer. The courtroom was packed as William Millman, the accused, was brought in to face charges of murdering Mary Tuplin. Millman maintained a calm demeanor as he entered the dock. Jury selection commenced with the defense and prosecution exercising their rights to challenge potential jurors. Eventually, a panel of 12 men was sworn in to hear the case. Mr. F. Peters, Associate Counsel for the Crown, delivered the opening address to the jury. He urged them to set aside any preconceived notions and stay focused solely on the evidence presented in court. Peters laid out the prosecution case against William Millman, stating they would prove beyond doubt that Mary Tuplin was murdered on the evening of June 28, 1887, by William Millman. Quote, "We will show you that the man in the dock and no other man committed this crime," Peters declared. He proceeded to outline the key evidence, including Millman's alleged movements on the night of the murder, his alleged possession of the murder weapon, and his attempts to establish a false alibi afterward. Peters explained that Mary Tuplin had left her father's house around 9 p.m. on June 28th and was never seen alive again. Her body was then discovered a week later in the Southwest River, weighed down by a heavy stone. She'd been shot in the head twice. The prosecutor asserted this clearly indicated murder, calling it a crime of, quote, "the most brutal nature that put the perpetrator, quote, outside the pale of mercy." A large map of the area was displayed to help jurors visualize the crime scene and surrounding locations. Peters used this to describe Millman's alleged movements, explaining how he could have traveled from his home across the river to the Tuplin residence on the night in question. Crucially, Peters said that they would prove Millman borrowed the murder weapon, a pistol, from a man named Power about 2 weeks before the killing. He kept it until shortly after the murder, returning it with 2 chambers empty. The bullets found in Mary's head, although almost destroyed, matched the caliber of this weapon. The prosecution planned to establish a motive as well. Peters pointed out that Mary Tuplin, although not yet 17, was 5 to 6 months pregnant at the time of her death, and while they lacked direct evidence Millman was responsible, Peters said that they would show he had the opportunity to seduce her months earlier and had recently learned of her condition. Quote, "We will prove that he was at Tuplin's house about New Year's night and that while there he had ample opportunity of doing so," Peters stated. He added that Millman allegedly told a friend he was charged with being the father, calling it, quote, "a penitentiary matter due to Mary's young age." Peters argued that Millman had strong motives, fear of criminal punishment for seduction, and worry his mentally fragile mother would, quote, "go wild" upon learning of the situation. The prosecutor said they would prove Millman arranged a secret meeting with Mary at the Sunday before her death, likely to set up their final encounter. Quote, "In short, we will prove Millman's connection with the boat, his being in the neighborhood of the house, his possession of the pistol, and will give good reasons why he should commit the crime," Peters concluded. The first witness called was John Tuplin, Mary's father. He testified about last seeing his daughter alive on the evening of June 28th, her departure, and his ultimate searches for her. Under cross-examination, Tuplin's memory was shown to be somewhat inconsistent on certain details. He struggled to recall specifics about who was present during Millman's visit and admitted his recollection of times and dates could be faulty. The defense highlighted these inconsistencies, of course, to cast doubt on Tuplin's testimony.
Thinking that, in a time before forensic evidence and before science could do the heavy lifting, guilt was often decided not by weight of evidence, but often by public opinion, right? And I don't know if it was public opinion here, but public opinion back then had so much to do with guilt and innocence, I find.
The next witness, Archibald Bryanton, described participating in the search for Mary and ultimately discovering her body in the Southwest River on July 4th. He provided details about the location and condition of Mary's body, including the stone and rope used to weigh it down. Bryanton's testimony also touched on an incident where John Tuplin had allegedly caught Mary with 2 young men and, quote, "scared them off" shortly before her disappearance. This hinted at possible alternative suspects, though Bryanton downplayed the event's significance. As the trial's first day concluded, the prosecution had begun laying out its circumstantial case against William Millman. They faced the challenge of proving his guilt beyond a reasonable doubt, despite a lack of direct evidence tying him to Mary Tuplin's death. The defense, meanwhile, worked to sow seeds of doubt by highlighting inconsistencies and suggesting other possible scenarios. The dramatic testimony and high stakes ensured the Millman-Tuplin trial would remain the subject of intense public interest as it unfolded in the Charlottetown courtroom. More after a quick break. And we are back. Matthew, thoughts so far?
Again, Mike, this is an interesting one, right? Because it's really small town and a long time ago, right?
Yeah.
And sort of, a murder alone was shocking. A hidden pregnancy adds to, quote, scandal back then, and I think back in 1887, scandal could be just as dangerous as a smoking gun, right?
Totally. Yep, totally. I mean, it wasn't just like, oh, she was 17 and pregnant. She was unmarried, and all this was...
Back then, scandal, yeah.
Huge.
Yeah, and scandal's dangerous, right? Even if you have nothing to do with the murder or anything else, if you're embroiled in the scandal back then, right, it's very dangerous.
And what we haven't addressed is the idea of seduction as a crime in Victorian Canada. During that period, courts, including those in PEI, upheld an ideology of female chastity and innocence. Judges often rejected attempts to depict women as willing participants or loose individuals unless overwhelming evidence supported such claims. Men accused of seduction faced severe penalties, including imprisonment if their defense failed. This speaks again to William Millman's motive.
Yeah.
As the murder trial entered its second day, the prosecution continued building its case against the young defendant. The testimony would delve deeper into the medical evidence surrounding Mary Tuplin's death, as well as further accounts from those individuals in the search and investigation. The court prepared to hear from expert witnesses who would shed light on the brutal nature of the crime that had shocked the small Prince Edward Island community. The trial resumed with the testimony of Dr. McKay, the coroner who conducted the inquest on Mary Tuplin's body. Dr. McKay provided crucial medical evidence about the victim's condition and cause of death. He confirmed that a post-mortem examination had been carried out by himself and 3 other physicians, Dr. Wall, Dr. Alex McNeil, and Dr. Carruthers. Dr. McKay described the body as being, quote, in an advanced state of decomposition when discovered. Despite this, they were able to determine that Mary had been pregnant at the time of her death, estimating she was between 5 and 6 months along. This corroborated the prosecution's claims about her condition and potential motive for her murder. The coroner testified that they found 2 gunshot wounds on the body, one to the back of her head and another to the left side of her face. Dr. McKay stated, quote, either of these wounds would cause instant death. Further medical testimony revealed that the bullets recovered from Mary's body were consistent with being fired from a .32 caliber revolver. This aligned with the prosecution's claims about the murder weapon allegedly borrowed by Millman. Dr. McKay also noted that the body showed no signs of a struggle, suggesting Mary may have been shot unexpectedly or from behind. Following the medical evidence, the court heard from several individuals involved in searching for Mary and discovering her body. Jonathan Adams testified about participating in the search efforts along the Southwest River. He described using grappling hooks to probe the riverbed, eventually snagging something heavy. Adams recounted the moment they raised Mary's body from the water. Quote, when we got her to the surface, I saw her face. It was swollen. Her eyes were closed. She had on a dress. I think it was a light color. End quote. The witness also provided details about the stone and rope used to weigh down the body. Adams estimated the stone weighed about 80 to 90 pounds and identified the rope as similar to that commonly used for tying up cattle. Several other search participants also offered similar accounts, reinforcing the prosecution's timeline of events and the condition of Mary's body when it was found. The trial then shifted focus to establishing Millman's movements and actions around the time of Mary's disappearance. Millman's sister, Mary Eliza, testified that while their parents attended a church meeting, William told her he was going to the river to bathe. This statement placed him near the Southwest River where Mary's body would later be discovered. Witnesses reported seeing a stranger in dark clothing near the river before sundown, though only one person identified this figure as Millman. Later that evening, Millman's mother, Joanna, returned from the church meeting after 10 o'clock to find that William was not home. A few minutes later, she saw him standing in the kitchen dressed in dark clothes, which aligned with the description of the man seen near the river. The prosecution argued that Millman had taken the boat belonging to John Cousins from its mooring place and used it to dispose of Mary's body in the river. The boat was later found moored below Millman's house, not in its original location, and additionally, one of the large stones used as ballast in the boat was missing and was believed to be the same stone found tied later to Mary's body. James Muddert testified about encountering Millman on the evening of June 28, shortly before Mary was last seen alive. Muddert stated that he saw Millman walking along the road near the Tuplin property around 8:30 p.m. Quote, "He appeared to be in a hurry," Muddert recalled. "When he saw me, he seemed startled and quickly turned onto a side path." End quote. Another key witness was Thomas Power, the man who allegedly lent Millman the murder weapon. Power testified that Millman had borrowed his .32 caliber revolver 2 weeks before Mary's disappearance, claiming he wanted to try it out before possibly purchasing it. Power stated, quote, "He returned the gun to me on July 1st or 2nd. 2 of the chambers were empty, and he asked me not to mention it to anyone that he had borrowed it." End quote. The prosecution also called several of Millman's acquaintances to testify about his behavior and statements in the days surrounding Mary's death. John Evans recounted a conversation with Millman on June 29th, the day after Mary vanished. Evans claimed Millman appeared agitated and asked him to provide a false alibi. Quote, "He wanted me to say we were together the previous evening," Williams testified. "When I refused, he became angry and said I would regret not helping him." End quote. As the trial progressed, the prosecution continued to build its circumstantial case against the defendant. They wove together medical evidence, eyewitness accounts, and alleged attempts by Millman to cover his tracks. While no single piece of evidence definitively proved his guilt, the cumulative effect painted a damning picture. The defense, led by Mr. Hodgson, worked diligently to challenge witness credibility and suggest alternative explanations for the evidence. They highlighted inconsistencies in testimonies and argued that much of the prosecution's case was based on speculation rather than hard facts. Hodgson mainly focused on attacking the credibility of witnesses who claimed to have seen Millman in incriminating circumstances. He suggested that poor lighting, distance, and the passage of time could have led to misidentifications or faulty memories. The defense also sought to introduce evidence of other potential suspects, including the young men John Tuplin had allegedly caught with Mary shortly before her death. Hodgson argued that the prosecution had tunnel vision in focusing solely on Millman and had failed to investigate other possibilities thoroughly. Anticipation would build for William Millman's testimony as the trial entered its later stages. Would he take the stand in his defense? If so, how would he explain the mounting evidence against him? The case's outcome could hinge on his ability to offer credible alternative explanations for the prosecution's allegations. However, as was his right, William Millman chose not to testify. The Millman-Tuplin trial captivated the community and the rest of the tiny province. The courtroom was packed daily, and newspapers provided extensive coverage. The Crown had called 48 witnesses to the stand throughout the 11-day trial. In his closing arguments, prosecutor F. Peters painted a picture of a calculating killer who had carefully planned Mary's murder to avoid the consequences of his actions. Quote, "William Millman saw this young girl as an obstacle to be removed," Peters declared. "He lured her to a secluded spot, shot her in cold blood, and disposed of her body in the river. His attempts to create an alibi and conceal evidence prove his guilt." End quote. Defense attorney Hodgson, in turn, implored the jury to remember the high standard of proof required in a criminal case. Quote, "The prosecution has offered you a story, but stories are not enough to send a man to the gallows," he argued. "There is no direct evidence tying William Millman to this terrible crime. You must acquit him if you have any reasonable doubt." End quote. As the judge prepared to give his final instructions to the jury, tension in the courtroom was palpable. The fate of William Millman and justice for Mary Tuplin now rested in the hands of 12 men. The jury deliberated for several hours before reaching their decision. When they filed back into the courtroom, a hush fell over the assembled crowd. The foreman stood and delivered the verdict. Quote, "We find the defendant, William Millman, guilty of the murder of Mary Pickering Tuplin." End quote. Millman reportedly collapsed upon hearing the verdict, having to be carried out of the courtroom by guards. Judge Hensley thanked the jury for their service and set a date for sentencing. The conviction carried a mandatory death sentence at the time.
Could you imagine waiting for the jury to come back if you were going to be killed according to their answer, right?
Right.
That's the moment when everything stops. The trial's done, the arguments are over. There's nothing to do but wait at this point and hope that whatever side of the door you're on, you like what's coming, sort of thing. And could you imagine, Mike, especially, imagine if you're innocent and you're being charged for murder and you're standing there, you're innocent. I'm not saying he is or isn't, but you are. And there's this 12 people that are going to decide.
So what do you think about this case? Having read everything, it's completely circumstantial. This whole thing is circumstantial. He had a .32, which he had given back to his friend. The boat that had the rock missing was now tied up in front of his place, kind of thing. I mean, there were a lot of circumstantial things that made it look as though William had means, motive, and opportunity, but there was zero physical evidence against him.
With the ones that are this old, I kind of I enjoy the story. And I can't really draw conclusions, just because we know what newspapers were like back then.
They lied a lot.
Well, they still do, right?
Yeah.
They lie on one side or the other or somewhere in the middle. And it's just with these, like, do you think he did it? I'm like, I have no idea, right? Because who knows?
There are still people who will argue that they think he was innocent, but how do you know?
Good for them, but how do you know, right? It's so much time and so many stories, and
William Millman was sentenced to be hanged. In the days that followed, appeals were filed on Millman's behalf, but ultimately rejected. William Millman was hanged on April 10, 1888. He was 20 years old. The New Brunswick Telegraph-Journal newspaper recounted the proceedings in an article on page 2 the next day. The article was titled, "The Gallows. Millman Meets Death Firmly. A Life for a Life. Mary Tuplin's Murder Avenged by Law." End quote. The article painted a somber picture. Millman had awakened early after a restless night, spending his final hours in prayer and reflection. He abstained from breakfast and was visited by his spiritual advisor, Reverend James Simpson, at 7 a.m. Shortly before 8, the sheriff, executioner, and a constable entered his cell to remove his restraints and prepare him for execution. The prisoner bid farewell to those present, weeping as he was handcuffed. At precisely 8 a.m., a solemn procession began from the prisoner's cell, led by Reverend Simpson, followed by the prisoner, flanked by 2 officers, the sheriff, executioner, and jail staff. The condemned man, blindfolded at his own request, walked firmly but hesitantly for about 50 feet to the scaffold. Upon reaching the scaffold, the prisoner stood steadily as his legs were bound. He was neatly dressed in dark attire, his face partially obscured by the blindfold. As the sheriff recited his crime, the condemned man remained composed, though his breathing was labored. Reverend Simpson offered a prayer, which the prisoner appeared to follow silently. The executioner then placed a black cap over the prisoner's head and secured the noose around his neck. The condemned man showed remarkable composure at the face of his impending death. After the Lord's Prayer was recited, the executioner activated the lever, causing the prisoner to fall through the trapdoor at 8:08 a.m. The body hung motionless for about a minute before exhibiting convulsive movements and trembling. At 8:19, doctors pronounced the prisoner dead. The body was then removed, examined by a coroner's jury, and buried in the People's Cemetery at 10 a.m. William proclaimed his innocence all the way to the end. In his only statement, days before his hanging, he'd written a letter to the editor of a local paper, T. Heath Haviland. William wrote in part, quote, "I may not be able to say anything at the last hour of my life, and I say now what I would have if I was able. At my trial, there was false swearing and false evidence against me, and because of this I was found guilty, and they took my life. It was hard at first to forgive them, but I do forgive them. God knows I do, and I pray for them. I have no fear of dying, but I don't say this boasting. One thing I want to say, I had the best father and mother a boy ever had. Millman then thanked the men who defended him and concluded by saying, quote, "One of these days all will be known. O Lord Jesus Christ, to thee I cling in an hour of death, and in the day of judgment, dear Savior, deliver me, William Millman." End quote. The tragic story of Mary Tuplin's murder was horrific, but the subsequent handling of her remains also remains a haunting tale that has been passed down through generations in Prince Edward Island. After Mary's body was discovered in the Southwest River, a post-mortem examination was conducted on the shore, as we mentioned. However, during this examination, her head was detached from her body and sent to Charlottetown as evidence. This gruesome act set in motion a series of events that would take over a century to resolve.
Yeah, this is just, this should have been the end of it, but they just created this whole mess.
Yeah.
Out of this. And why would they take her head off? Just cheaper to ship the evidence than the whole body or something?
It was easier to move than an entire body? I don't understand it either. You
kind of think even in 1887, people sort of had respect for bodies, right? It doesn't seem like that's something that probably was regularly done.
Right. So Mary's body, without head, was buried in the Margate cemetery the night after she was found. The circumstances of her burial were particularly heartbreaking. As Bobby Williams, a distant relative, recounted to the Toronto Sun in 2016, quote, "She was put in the ground without a casket, without family, and without service. Adding to the tragedy, Mary was laid to rest in the same plot where her younger brother had been buried just days before. For almost 130 years, Mary's skull remained separated from her body. It was stored at the Johnson & Johnson Pharmacy in Charlottetown, which also served as the coroner's office. As the building changed hands over the years, the skull and other historical items were passed down to each new owner. Upon learning about his family's connection to this dark chapter of PEI history, Bobby Williams felt compelled to take action. He embarked on a mission to locate Mary's skull and give her a proper burial. Williams' search led him to a surprising discovery. The former pharmacy had since been converted into a Chinese restaurant, and during renovations, someone stumbled upon a box containing Mary's skull. William explained, quote, "Someone was digging through the building and found this well-labeled box containing the head of Mary Tuplin." End quote. Determined to right this historical wrong, Williams organized a proper burial ceremony. On August 21, 2016, 129 years after Mary's death, about 30 of her relatives gathered at the United Church Cemetery in Margate for a solemn service. A minister officiated the ceremony, fulfilling William's wish to give Mary the dignity she had been denied for so long. Williams reflected on the event's significance, saying, quote, "We did have a ceremony. She did have a box, and she did have her family there. We're finally grateful, very grateful." End quote. What a horrible thing. Her family, her mom and dad and brothers and sisters, knew her head was somewhere else? Or did they even know this? It's a really strange situation.
What I find interesting is that 129 years later, it's almost not for Mary or Mary's descendants, right? But it's about human dignity.
Right.
It's almost like for everyone that this stuff is done.
We could do a whole episode on the British Museum. Anyway, that's it for Dark Poutine episode 359, Margate Horror, The Murder of Mary Pickering Tuplin. That's right. It's time for voicemails. You can leave us a message at 1-877-327-5786 or 1-877-DARK-PTN. We'd love to hear from you. Let's see who called us this week. And it is time for some voicemails, so let's listen to our first one here.
Hello, Mike and Matthew. This is Kelly McDonald Mason. You might remember me from such stories as my uncle, the Shubenacadie bank robber, my great uncle, and my suggestion of the Amos Babcock craziness. Also a frequenter of the Umber Yard. So in all these mining stories, it brought to mind that I may have suggested this at one point. A great story for you to cover would be the Moose River gold mine disaster. This occurred in the Musquodoboit Valley area of Nova Scotia, where I grew up. It happened in 1936 when 3 men got trapped in the gold mine. And this was became an international story because it was broadcast by the Canadian Radio Broadcasting Corporation at the time. And it was the first live 24-hour broadcast and on radio. And the interesting thing about that was everyone was still on party lines. So when he wanted to make his calls to broadcast his story that day, they had to get everyone to hang up so he could actually use the phone lines. So there's just a little bit of Canadiana history. I won't give away all the details of the story in case you want to cover it. But it's quite an interesting little tale to tell. Anyway, go take a shit in your hat. Hang tough, elbows up. We can do this. And I appreciate hearing all the stories and appreciate you guys so much. And Matthew, I wish you best of health, and we hope to hear from you for a very long time. Thanks. Bye.
Thank you, Kelly.
There you go. Yes, thank you. I wasn't aware of that story. That's interesting.
It sounds like a fascinating story.
I wonder if the audio still exists somewhere. I mean, I can't obviously play it because it belongs to the CBC, but I'd be interested just out of curiosity to hear it for myself. I mean, yeah, it's a fascinating story. It is.
Yeah, and we see Kelly in the yard often, and so Kelly, thank you for the good luck with the health. The good news is this Friday the doctor called to say I don't need any radiation or chemo or hormones or anything like that, which is great news for me. Now, of course, I need to have tests every 3 months. I think for the rest of my life, but I'm celebrating quarterly.
There you go. And about the Shubenacadie bank robbery, there's not a lot of information out there. So if anybody wants to help us out and send me all the information you have on the Shubenacadie bank robbery, that would be fantastic. If you have links, if you have news stories, all of those kind of things, I would love to have more information.
Shubenacadie. That's fun to say, Mike. Shubenacadie.
Or as people pronounce it on the U.S. news, Shubenacadie.
No, Shubenacadie.
Shubenacadie. That's where Malcolm's from. Our buddy Malcolm is from Shubenacadie.
No.
Yes. Or as you would call it, as he would call it, Shuby.
The Shubes.
The Shubes.
The Shubes.
Anyway, moving on.
Hi, boys. It's Lacey in Calgary. I just wanted to say I'm glad to hear that Matthew's feeling pretty good. And, I care about you too, Mike, after your loss. But it's good to hear from you guys. And I really enjoyed the latest episodes, the one on sleepwalking and, and the mysteries. It was so interesting. But anyway, I thought of a nickname. It's not very clever, but you guys could be called the Pen and Wardrobe. Because Mike, you write. You're an author. You write these podcasts, and I always see those pictures of your new shirts and your interesting outfits, Matthew. So yeah, the Pen and Wardrobe. Hopefully, someone comes up with something more clever than that. But just wanted to call and say hi. Take care. Bye.
Thanks, Lacey.
Thank you, Lacey.
I immediately thought about the Q words. The Quill and the Queen. How about that?
Dear.
Oh, dear.
The Quirk and the Queer.
Oh, no. Well, thank you so much for your voicemails. Much appreciated. Oh, boy. We are forging forth, Matthew.
Forging forth.
That's it for this week's voicemails. Again, you can leave us one at 1-877-327-5786 or 1-877-DARK-PTN. We'd love to hear from you, even if it is just to say hi and to tell us to go shit in our hats. If you're stumped for what to chat with us about, a quick story is welcome. Alrighty, we don't have any new patrons to speak of. However, Matthew, we do have a donut money donor. And that person is Melissa Sovereign. And Melissa says, pitch in for a new shirt for Matthew. They are probably more than $30. Or a Persian for Mike. I'm from Thunder Bay and Persians are delicious. What is a Persian? A Persian, Matthew? Do you know what a Persian from Thunder Bay is?
No, but the majority of my shirts are about $11 to $15.
so $30 could buy you two. Okay, so here's what a Persian is. It's called a Thunder Bay Persian roll. And if you're in Thunder Bay, Ontario, there's one thing you absolutely must do. Treat yourself to a Persian. It is similar to a cinnamon bun, says Danny Nucci, owner of the legendary Bennett's Bakery and the Persian Man in Thunder Bay. What makes it different from anything else is its icing on top. It's not only sweet, but it gives you a good feeling. Oh my, and a Persian, it does look a lot like a cinnamon bun, but it's got like pink frosting on the top, and it looks like, let's just say, it would use all my Weight Watchers points for the day.
It's so weird that this is like specific to Thunder Bay.
Yeah.
And it looks nothing like any of the Persian pastries that I've ever had.
No. So what do you think Melissa Sovereign does there in Thunder Bay, Matthew?
I think Melissa is a baker and
Bakes Persians.
and a coin collector.
Okay. Oh, Sovereign. I gotcha.
Get it? Yeah,
yes.
See what I did there?
Sovereign, like our nation. Never
Sovereign's
51. Never 51.
Sovereign's a great last name.
It is. It is very good.
Yeah.
It's very regal, that last name. Mm-hmm.
It is. Yeah.
Thanks to all our patrons and Donut Money donors, past and present, for your generosity. It helps to keep the show going. You can become a patron of Dark Poutine at patreon.com/darkpoutine. For a one-time donation, you can send us donut money via PayPal or interact using our email address, darkpoutinepodcast@gmail.com. If you don't already subscribe to the show, it would mean a lot if you did. You can easily find Dark Poutine on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to your favorite shows. If you haven't gotten yours yet, my 2 books are available to order via links on the Dark Poutine website or anywhere fine books are sold. And speaking of darkpoutine.com, check it out for show notes and other cool stuff. We'd appreciate it if you gave Dark Poutine a like or a follow on Facebook and Instagram. Most importantly, thank you for listening. Tell your friends about us. Word of mouth is a powerful thing. That's it for this episode of Dark Poutine, and hey Canada, elbows up, and don't forget to be a good egg and not a bad apple.
Bye, y'all.
Bye-bye.